So hello and good evening. I'm Sarah Halter. I'm the Executive Director of the Indiana Medical History Museum, and I'm very pleased to be here today for our Spirit and Place event, Changing Human Nature, Eugenics in Indiana. So this event is part of the 2021 Spirit and Place Festival, which, as they describe themselves, is a platform for artists, scholars, congregations, and others to strengthen community by tackling a yearly theme through the lens of humanities, religion, and the arts. This year, the theme appropriately is change. So now I have the great pleasure of introducing tonight's main speaker, Dr. Richard Gunderman. Richard Gunderman, MD and PhD, is a distinguished medical doctor, writer, and historian. He's the Chancellor's Professor of Radiology, Pediatrics, Medical Education, Philosophy, Liberal Arts, Philanthropy, and Medical Humanities and Health Studies at Indiana University. He's also the John A. Campbell Professor of Radiology, and he is author of more than 700 articles and 12 books, including his two most recent books, Tesla, which came out in 2019, and Marie Curie in 2020. And of course, this evening, he is here to share with us some of his research for his newest project on eugenics. So I'm going to slip into the background now and let Dr. Gunderman and his students take over.
Thanks so much, Sarah. It's a treat to be with you. I want to extend my thanks to Spirit and Place for putting on this event, which I hope will stimulate some reflection and discussion that's meaningful to each of us. I'd also like to thank Sarah and the Indiana Medical History Museum for hosting. It's a terrific organization. If you haven't visited, I encourage you to do so. You know, we have the George Santayana papers on the IUPUI campus. George Santayana, I think, would rank as one of the most important philosophers in US history. Santayana famously said that those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. And the Medical History Museum plays a terrific role in helping us get to know the history of medicine, healthcare, and to some degree, our changing understanding of the human body and the diseases that afflict it. And I'd also like to thank Salil and Ritika, who some of you will get to meet later, but they're two of the top undergraduate students on the Indiana University Bloomington campus and are actually enrolled with me this semester in a course on eugenics. So I'm so delighted they're able to be with us and will help facilitate the breakout room discussions, which we'll get to in due course. But first, I'll say something about the history of eugenics with a focus on eugenics here in our state of Indiana. And I'd just like to say these are unpleasant, disturbing topics, and I'm sorry about that, but you know, there's much in human life and human affairs and human history that's unpleasant or disturbing. And if we take Santayana at his word, we can't afford to overlook things that are unpleasant or disturbing on that basis, because we may find ourselves in the midst of similar bad ideas and similar bad public policies if we're not careful. So it's a real treat to get to work on this problem or topic. It's the intersection of things like medicine and healthcare, biological sciences and genetics, economics, public policy, ethics. I could go on, but anyway, it's a fascinating topic. No discipline, no profession has a monopoly on our understanding of eugenics. We really need multiple disciplines and professions to get a comprehensive view of it. And that'll be apparent to some degree in tonight's presentation. So this is a marker many of you have seen. That's the State House in the background. Indiana has the dubious distinction of having enacted the world's first eugenic forced sterilization law. And I just want to mention that my colleague Bill Schneider, who's a historian of medicine, and our medical humanities program at IUPUI organized a great conference for the centennial of the eugenics law in 2007, and a great deal of good scholarship coalesced around that meeting, and I'll be drawing on some of that to some degree tonight. But again, Indiana was number one. States like Michigan and Pennsylvania tried to pass eugenic sterilization laws, but Indiana got there first. And that's not a happy chapter in our state's history, but tonight's presentation might help us understand a little better how and why that happened. So tonight I want to talk about some of the founders of eugenics. Now, at least two of them never heard of eugenics, but people who laid the foundation, so to speak, for what came to be called eugenics. Then talk about three important figures in the history of our state, all of whom could be fairly described as eugenicists, in fact, very prominent eugenicists. Then we'll give a bit of time to the opponents of eugenics. And then finally, just talk a little bit about how popular this idea called eugenics became in the first few decades of the 20th century here in Indiana, in the United States, and to a large degree around a good part of the world. So it's an incredible story. It's a very sad story in many respects, but it's vital that we know that story, because I think there's real potential that we might find ourselves making some of the same mistakes if we're not pretty well educated about what happened in the past. So we'll begin with this man, an important student of human populations, Thomas Malthus. I think most of us, seeing his last name, we see Mal, like malady or maladjusted, might assume there's something evil in his surname, but in fact, Malthus was a contraction of malt house. His family had a malt house, producing beer and that sort of thing. Malthus lived in the late 18th and early 19th century, attended Jesus College at Cambridge University, became an Anglican cleric. So he was a man of the cloth, perhaps equivalent to a rabbi or an imam or a minister, pastor, priest, something like that. And in 1798, he published an important essay on the principle of population. And Malthus said that the power of population is indefinitely greater than the power of the earth to produce subsistence for man. So the idea here is that the human population tends to outstrip the resources available to support it. And Malthus regarded this as a real problem, both in the past and for the future of humanity. He never talked about eugenics. That term wasn't coined until a half century after he died, but he laid the groundwork for it by saying, in essence, resources are scarce and human beings will have to compete for those resources. And, we'll see later on with Darwin, fitter individuals were going to tend to win out in that competition. So here's a little graph showing the change in human population and resources over time. And Malthus's theory basically suggests that resources can only increase arithmetically. The production of food crops, or for that matter, the availability of fresh water, those resources will only increase arithmetically, but human populations tend to increase geometrically. And because of that, we have a tendency to reach a Malthusian catastrophe, a point where the population grows beyond the ability of resources to support it. And then, a crisis ensues. Now, Malthus thought there were a few forces operating to check the growth of human populations, one of which he called a preventive check. Suppose in the year 1800, before we knew too much about contraceptives, at least compared to today, suppose in the year 1800, you wanted to check the growth of human populations. Well, Malthus thought that would be possible. For example, if you could get people to delay marriage. Let's say in the past, everybody got married at age 20. Now it's going to be age 30. Families are going to tend to have fewer children because they've delayed childbearing. It's interesting that Malthus doesn't talk about mating or reproduction. He talks about marriage, the presumption being that babies are being born, I guess, within wedlock. Another possibility, which he saw practiced among priests and nuns and so forth, people who've taken a vow of celibacy, was to abstain from reproduction entirely. And then another possibility would be legislation. Perhaps there are some individuals you wouldn't want to get married and have children. For example, I don't know, poor people. Malthus wondered whether poor people should be able to get married because they don't have the means to support their offspring. So those he called preventive checks. He also talked about positive checks, certainly not positive in a way from our point of view. But Malthus thought, when the human population gets too dense, conflicts will tend to break out. And to some degree, people will kill each other. Famines will break out. That will reduce the rate of growth and in some cases reduce human population. And finally, plagues. As population density goes up, the transmission of infectious diseases tends to increase. We're seeing a little bump in COVID-19 cases now, probably because of cold weather. We're spending more time indoors. So one implication here, very important for Charles Darwin, who we'll talk about in a few minutes, is that human beings are going to be competing for scarce resources. Very important idea from Thomas Malthus. Then we go to Charles Lyle, an Oxford University, Exeter College graduate, who was a Scottish geologist, and in 1830 published The Principles of Geology. Basically, for our purposes, the big contribution of Lyle is that he showed to his own satisfaction and that of many other people that the Earth is a whole lot older than most people had thought. In other words, there was a great deal more time than people assumed for changes to take place, geological changes, but also biological changes. So Lyle wrote that amidst the vicissitudes of the Earth's surface, species cannot be immortal, but must perish. Aristotle considered the idea, Aristotle, perhaps the greatest biologist in human history, he considered the idea that species might go extinct, a new species might come into being, but rejected it. Here Lyle's saying, yeah, that's going to happen. Species will perish one after another, just like the individuals who compose those species, and there's really no possibility of escaping the extinction of species. So Lyle was an adherent and proponent of the idea of uniformitarianism. Basically, we can understand the past history of geology by looking at the geologic processes at work in our own day. And I say again, deep time was a crucial idea, that the history of the Earth might go back not just thousands, but millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions. Now, there's some think the Earth might be 4.7 billion years old. Well, that was a very important idea for Charles Darwin, that what he'll call natural selection has had a vast sweep of time in which to do its work. So this is actually Darwin talking about his friend and teacher, Charles Lyle. He said his grand work on the principles of geology, which the future historian will recognize as having produced a revolution in natural science, yet does not admit how incomprehensibly vast have been the past periods of time, may at once close this volume. In other words, the readers of Darwin's On the Origin of Species must adopt the view that the Earth is very, very old, or they might as well just close the book and read no further. So with Lyle and Malthus, we've got the ground laid for Charles Darwin, another contender perhaps for the title of the most important biologist who ever lived. He attended Christ College, Cambridge. He was a geologist, a naturalist, a biologist. And in 1859, he publishes On the Origin of Species. He writes, as many more individuals of each species are born than can possibly survive, there is a frequently recurring struggle for existence. And in that struggle, organisms that vary will be selected for or against, depending how well adapted they are to the environment. So from the strong principle of inheritance, any selected variety will tend to propagate its new and modified form. Here you can see in the image the voyage of the HMS Beagle. Those of you who know medical history know that one of the most respected English-speaking physicians in history, William Osler, his grandfather actually had the chance to be the science officer aboard the Beagle, but declined the opportunity, and eventually it fell to Charles Darwin. But Darwin's theory of natural selection, basically grounded in the view organisms vary from each other. Let's say no two human beings look exactly alike. Those variations are going to be important in competition for scarce resources. Over time, some will survive and others won't. And only those who survive will be able to reproduce. This, of course, gets amplified or magnified with the work of Richard Dawkins and his book from decades ago, The Selfish Gene. So that's all by way of laying a foundation for the person who founds eugenics. And that, of course, is Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton. How ironic that eugenics would be a coined term and an idea formulated for the first time by a cousin of Charles Darwin. You might say the father or a father of natural selection. Galton actually never graduated from university, but he was an incredible polymath. I mean, in statistics, our notion of regression to the mean. He was an explorer of the continent of Africa. He introduced fingerprinting as we know it today. The first weather map. Galton was an incredible polymath. And in 1883, he publishes a work called Inquiries into Human Faculty and Its Development. And Galton basically says eugenics, eu means good or well. Genics, I guess, would mean origin or birth or something like that. The well-born or people with good origins, people who came from good stock. That's where we get the term eugenics. And Galton said it's the science that deals with the influences that improve the inborn qualities of a race. There's so many problematic terms in that definition, but we'd need hours to unpack them. Galton basically thought there are two kinds of marriages: dysgenic, which tend to lower the quality, so to speak, of the human race, and eugenic, which tend to elevate the quality of the human race. You can see here in this poster, public education poster, the idea that individuals among us are reproducing. The eugenicists might have said breeding, like a weed, a vine, a parasite that's going to kill a tree. And the mission of eugenics is to get rid of those parasites. Galton said there exists a sentiment, for the most part quite unreasonable, against the gradual extinction of an inferior race. I mean, Galton was willing to see some human races, if such things even exist, extinguished, so that the overall average quality of humanity would be increased. I'm uttering so many words that I think are so deeply problematic. They're painful to utter, but this is the way the eugenicists talked. And even Charles Darwin was aware of this. He writes in The Descent of Man in 1871. To me, this might be one of the most disturbing things I'm going to read. With savages, the weak in body or mind are soon eliminated. In the course of human history, thousands, tens of thousands of years ago, the weak were eliminated. They couldn't survive. They couldn't feed themselves or what have you. Today, however, we civilized human beings do our utmost to check the process of elimination. For example, we build hospitals where we care for the sick, thereby allowing the sick, or let's say those predisposed to illness, to survive. He thinks it's problematical that people like me, so-called medical men, exert our utmost skill to save the life of everyone to the last moment. From Darwin's point of view, the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. Here's a really troubling sentence. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. Allowing the weak and infirm to survive and propagate their kind must be injurious to the race of man. Hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed. Wow. There you have it in a way. Darwin, writing before his cousin Francis Galton, laying out, what amounts to the point of view of eugenics. So this gives us a sense, at least, of what eugenics is, what sorts of ideas were at work in the thinking and policy suggestions of eugenicists. Now I want to see how that plays out a little closer to home. This is where I spend much of my working life. Some of you perhaps have visited Riley Hospital for Children downtown in Indianapolis on the IUPUI campus. We work hard to save the lives of premature infants and toddlers and so forth. Are we doing the wrong thing? Here are 3 images of individuals who have diseases, diagnosable medical conditions. This image on the upper left is an MRI image of a patient's heart. Basically, it shows a hole between the right atrium and left atrium. It shows more than that, but this patient has what we call an atrial septal defect. Should we fix that? Well, if you talk to the pediatric cardiologists or cardiothoracic surgeons at Riley Hospital, of course we should. That'll save this person's life and dramatically improve their quality of life. I'm not sure what the eugenicists would have said. Here in the middle, we've got what we call a plain radiograph of a newborn infant's thorax and abdomen. I'm not going to say why, but I can tell from this picture, this baby has esophageal atresia. The esophagus is in a continuous tube going down to the stomach, and this baby has duodenal atresia, basically a blockage in the first part of the small intestine. This baby can't survive without 2 surgeries. We would need to restore patency to the esophagus and to the small intestine. Otherwise, this baby will die, in a week of starvation. Finally, here's a photograph of a couple of kids who have a form of achondroplasia. Basically, they don't make normal cartilage. The eugenicists might have been perfectly prepared to say that we shouldn't intervene in cases like this, because if we do, we're enabling the weak and infirm to survive and propagate their kind. And, they may be more likely to have children who have similar congenital abnormalities. What do we do with that? Well, again, this point of view became very popular here in our home state of Indiana. And I want to talk about 3 people who I think you could describe as ardent eugenicists, proponents, sometimes almost rabid proponents of eugenics. One is David Starr Jordan, who had a legitimate PhD from Butler University and, at least a somewhat earned medical degree from a forerunner of the Indiana University School of Medicine. Jordan was one of the world's most highly regarded ichthyologists. He studied fishes. He served as the 7th president of Indiana University and the founding president of Stanford University, a very highly respected leader in higher education. By the way, he wasn't too involved in eugenics while he was in Indiana. His eugenics star really started to rise once he moved out to California, but he became the chair of the American Breeders Association's Eugenics Committee. I mean, that speaks volumes right there. Who was promoting eugenics? The American Breeders Association, people who've been interested in the breeding of crops and livestock turned their attention to human beings in the form of eugenics. And, until last year, the biology building on the Indiana University campus was named Jordan Hall. His name's actually been removed because of his association with things like eugenics and racism. But David Starr Jordan said in selective breeding with any domestic animal or plant, it's possible with a little attention to produce wonderful changes. To select for posterity those individuals which best meet our needs or please our fancy, and to destroy those with unfavorable qualities is the function of artificial selection, not Darwin's natural selection, but now human beings are going to take the reins. We're going to sit down in the driver's seat and determine who gets to reproduce and who doesn't. Jordan thinks that's going to be of great benefit for humanity. He writes, we need to be mindful of the danger to free institutions of the presence of hordes of people who are not and cannot be free. Wow. Who are the people who are not and cannot be free? People who crowd the slums of great cities, who can't take care of their own rights, and whose descendants are still at the bottom, the same defenseless stock. Jordan thought there were groups of people in our midst who can't take care of themselves, who aren't fit to be citizens of a democracy, and who should, through some means, be reduced in number over the course of generations. And here's Jordan's the final statement I'm going to talk about tonight. And, clear racism here, right? When the Anglo-Saxon meets the Negro, the Chinaman, the Indian, the Mexican as fellow citizens, we have a raw wound in our political organism. Wow. Are you kidding? No, I'm not kidding. This is a president of Indiana University, the founding president of Stanford University, pretty clearly racist ideas. He thinks it's a bad idea for Anglo-Saxons to mix with inferior races. Wow. Let's go to another one. So remember, David Starr Jordan, president of Indiana University, one of the state's most highly respected leaders in higher education. Next, we turn to John Hurdy, who was director of the State Board of Health. As you can see, for about 25 years, director of the Indiana State Board of Health. And Jordan did much good for Indiana University and Stanford University, innovations in curriculum, teaching methods, and so forth. Similarly, John Hurdy did a lot of good, promoting sanitation throughout the state, pure drinking water. He enacted pure food and drug laws, which became models nationally. But, he was also director of the State Board of Health when Indiana passed its eugenic sterilization law. This is Hurdy at his desk. He was described by his biographer, Thurman Rice, who actually succeeded him at the State Board of Health. Rice talked about Hurdy's indomitable courage, his extraordinary industry, his great ingenuity, his amazing perseverance. But, maybe it doesn't matter in a way how effective you are if you're working for the wrong cause. It doesn't just matter how far we go, it matters what direction we go far in. And in a way, Hurdy undoubtedly inflicted a lot of damage. He wrote, the average number of children in a family in Indiana when both parents are feeble-minded is 7.5. Feeble-minded families are having the most children. Whether you believe in heredity, environment, education, decency, common sense, it is all wrong for the feeble-minded to be here and rearing the next generation of citizens and voters. I mean, this term feeble-minded was bandied about with abandon by the eugenicists. What does it mean, feeble-minded? How do you know who's feeble-minded? Well, you won't be surprised to learn that the eugenicists were early to embrace intelligence testing and thought they had a scientific method for determining who was a moron or an idiot or an imbecile. Words I shudder to speak, but these are terms they applied to human beings based on their intelligence test scores. Hurdy said there are pathological varieties of human beings. What? Pathological varieties of human beings multiplying and intermingling, leading down the hill of race degeneracy. Race degeneracy. What's that? What do you mean, race? What do you mean, degeneracy? Hurdy described marriage as an experiment in breeding. Every time two people get married and produce offspring, it's an experiment in breeding. What? And Hurdy actually envisions a day when people will look back. I don't know if he thought it would be as early as 2021, but he envisioned us telling our kids and grandkids about a day when we had criminals, idiots, the hereditary lame, the halt, and the blind, and that children would find that unbelievable because there aren't any people like that anymore. This was Hurdy's idea of the brave new world that eugenics would usher in. This, of course, is Hurdy's grave marker in Crown Hill Cemetery. The real practical method of restricting germplasm in case of criminals, idiots, imbeciles, and rapists is castration. You know, castrating people because they're thought not to be sufficiently intelligent, or maybe because they've committed crimes. Our mission, as he saw it, was to make the best of whatever germinal equipment is present in man. I mean, what becomes most important about us is, in a way, our genes. He's laying the groundwork for Richard Dawkins, the selfish gene. And, you know, Hurdy's a proponent of laws to prevent the breeding from the worst. So we've got Jordan, president of Indiana University, Hurdy, 25 years, the head of the state public health department. And then we've got this man, certainly the most disturbing of the characters we'll discuss, D.C. Stevenson, who was the Grand Dragon of the Indiana branch of the Ku Klux Klan. And it's, you know, you've heard the Klan was very big in Indiana, say in the 1920s, particularly the early 1920s. And in 1923, Stevenson publishes an article in the Klan's newspaper, The Fiery Cross. What does he say? Well, he's basically advocating against loose immigration laws. He wants to really tighten immigration so deficient people can't get into the country. Science tells us these types of disease, mental deficiency, social inadequacy are heritable. They're passed through the blood from one generation to another. For that very reason, they're more serious and must rouse us to a sense of the danger of the inescapable national impairment. To continue to admit members of inferior races into this country on a large scale can only mean the steady and inevitable decline in the physical, mental, and moral well-being of the American nation. Wow. Inferior races. By the way, at that time, immigration was shifting from, let's say, Western Europe to Eastern and Southern Europe. And for whatever reason, people from Eastern and Southern Europe were regarded as inferior, say, to the immigrants who'd come from Scandinavia or Great Britain or France or Germany. Stevenson wrote, masses of human beings of inferior races, ignorant of the ideals Americans hold dear, are poured into our factories as so much raw material. The new immigrant comes here as a foreigner and remains as a foreigner, a citizen of a lower class who, just as the Negro, is a constant menace to the standards of civilization which Americans hold dear. I mean, Stevenson seems utterly unaware that, in a sense, the United States is a nation of immigrants. You know, there have been waves of immigration since Europeans first came to this continent. But for some reason, he now thinks some of these immigrants or their descendants are now true Americans, but more recent immigrants or would-be immigrants aren't. And here's a really disturbing image. A little child, you know, with the hood and robe of a Klansman. Stevenson wrote, the great army of the unfit must be excluded at any cost. Rigid selection of the fit, rigid restriction of the unfit. This is the only policy that can save America today. Anything else will lead to the destruction of the American race, whatever that is. I mean, again, if we had hours or a whole semester like my students do, including Ritika and Salil, we could think deeply. What does he mean, American race? But for now, we'll just have to remember that these terms are thrown around in at least a sloppy fashion. That's probably a vast understatement, but I think it's fair. And this is the first eugenics conference logo, so to speak. Eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution. Wow, look at all down below, all the disciplines, all the professions that are feeding in to eugenics. And I just want to indicate to you, from my point of view, eugenics hasn't entirely been consigned to the dustbin of history. Let me give you one example. Trisomy 21 is one of the most common inherited chromosomal anomalies. This is a child with trisomy 21. It used to be called Mongolism. We still use the term Down syndrome. What do you think's happening to the rate at which babies are being born with trisomy 21 in Western Europe, the United States, and Iceland? Well, as you would surmise, it's going down. Prenatal screening makes it possible to determine what embryos and fetuses have trisomy 21, and parents have the option of terminating their pregnancy if they learn that the infant bears such a chromosomal anomaly. Well, that's happening. In Europe, the rate of trisomy 21 births is down 54%. Here in the US, it's down 33%. In Iceland, admittedly a small country, it's almost disappeared entirely. In a typical year in Iceland now, two babies are born per year with trisomy 21. Where prenatal testing happens, there's 100% termination rate. I mean, there's pressure, not a law, but there's got to be a lot of social pressure on would-be parents in Iceland not to bring a baby with trisomy 21 into the world, just a kind of peer pressure. By the way, I don't want to say this is eugenics, but I think we'd all have to admit it bears some striking similarities to eugenics. It's not a government imposed policy, but the rate of trisomy 21 births is down a lot. So I say a little bit about some opponents of eugenics. This is by no means exhaustive, but I wanted to pick a few people who took issue with eugenics and eugenicists in its heyday. So, there are more recent critics of eugenics, but these are people who were speaking out against it, writing out against it in the 19-teens, 1920s, early 1930s. One is, perhaps the father of American anthropology, I don't know, but Franz Boas. Boas really called into question the notion of race. He pointed out that race that term was originally a linguistic term, different languages or tongues. With time, it became associated with things like skin and hair color and facial features. And before long, people were using race to draft laws against miscegenation, basically the marriage of people from different races, to try to restrict immigration based on race, even to impose sterilization policies based on race. From Boas's point of view, that is intellectually unsound. Not even that it's morally wrong, it's intellectually unsound, because the very concept of race isn't nearly so robust as eugenicists suppose. Boas said eugenics should not be allowed to deceive us into the belief that we can raise a race of supermen, nor that we can eliminate all suffering and pain. He said eugenics is not a panacea. In other words, it's not a cure-all that will cure human ills. It's rather a dangerous sword that may turn its edge against those who rely on its strength. once we begin to divide human beings into categories and help some categories and harm other categories, we're introducing ideas, precedents, practices that could very well be used against other categories of human beings in the future. So there's a lot more to be said about Boas, but our time is short tonight, so I'm going to move on to a second important thinker, G.K. Chesterton, who in 1922 published a book called Eugenics and Other Evils. Chesterton was way out in front of a lot of other moralists or social commentators. Basically, Chesterton said eugenics is fundamentally flawed. For one thing, it's materialistic. It wants to say that the blood or genes or what we might call DNA is what's most important about a human being. If that were true, it's a very materialistic anthropology. You know, what's most important about a human being is the genes, let's say. Chesterton also said that it's deterministic. I mean, eugenicists think they can see what the journey will be before the first step has been taken. You know, what kind of offspring will these mating partners or will these spouses produce? They presumed they could see that in advance. And finally, from Chesterton's point of view, eugenics is inherently despotic, tyrannical, because it aims to control humanity through heredity. People are trying to control future generations based on notions about heredity, which, by the way, turn out not to be very robust. I'm not going to get into that tonight, but it is striking how bad the genetics or the understanding of heredity of many very prominent advocates of eugenics turned out to be. They were operating with a very superficial, simplistic understanding of human heredity. And Chesterton wrote, eugenics itself in large quantities or small, coming quickly or slowly, urged from good motives or bad, applied to 1,000 or 3, eugenics itself is a thing no more to be bargained about than poisoning. Eugenics is unsafe at any speed. There's no safe dose of eugenics. There's no safe pace of eugenics. It is inherently poisonous. I think this is kind of obscure, but I like it. Chesterton wrote that eugenicists are euphemists. They don't like short words, so they replace them with long words. But they're utterly incapable of seeing what their long words really mean. Even though they mean the same thing as the short words, most people would find obviously objectionable. So anyway, Chesterton's criticism, it's materialistic, deterministic, tyrannical, or despotic. And finally, the third criticism from a Roman Catholic Pope, Pius XI, who in a papal encyclical called basically chaste marriage, on chaste marriage, writes that the idea of preventing the unfit from marrying is wrong, is evil. Why? Because it represents punishing innocent people who've committed no crime. Why should somebody be prevented from marrying just because they're unfit? They haven't done anything wrong. They haven't made any immoral decision that should land them in prison. They shouldn't be punished. From the Pope's point of view, eugenics represents the state arrogating to itself power over a faculty, our reproductive capacity, arrogating to itself power over that faculty that it can never legitimately possess. The state has no business interfering in the reproductive powers of human beings. Pius XI wrote, public magistrates have no direct power over the bodies of their subjects. Therefore, where no crime has taken place, there's no cause present for punishment, they can never directly harm or tamper with the integrity of the body for eugenics or any other reason. I mean, these are powerful critiques of eugenics that were contemporaneous with the apogee, the high point. It's actually a terrible low point, but the high point of eugenics in American society. Again, if we had time, we could spend a whole semester thinking about the critics of eugenics and how much we can learn from their arguments. And I just want to let you know how prevalent eugenics was in the first few decades of the 20th century. Everybody you see listed on that left column express clearly eugenicist ideas. I'm not, by the way, trying to say we should condemn these people, but they harbored and promulgated some ideas that are very problematic, maybe flat out evil. One of them said that society has no business permitting degenerates to reproduce their kind. Who do you suppose that said that? Well, the answer is Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, progressivist Republican US president, the youngest person to assume the office of president in US history. But Woodrow Wilson, his Democratic successor, not immediate successor, but Wilson was a Democratic progressivist who expressed very similar views. I mean, eugenics cut right across party lines, no problem. Here's another eugenicist expressing a view. The unnatural and increasingly rapid growth of the feeble-minded and insane classes constitutes a national and race danger, which it is impossible to exaggerate. Who said that? Well, the answer is Winston Churchill. In many minds, a contender for the most important person of the 20th century. Churchill did a lot of good, but Churchill harbored ideas that I think we find abhorrent. And finally, another eugenicist, this is really ironic, wrote, "Our puny sentimentalism has caused us to forget that a human life is sacred only when it may be of some use to itself and the world." People need to be useful, If they're not, it's just sentimentalism that leads us to feed them and provide health care and so forth. Who do you suppose said that? Well, the answer is Helen Keller, who was certainly born with intact vision and hearing, but in fact lived most of her life blind and deaf. How ironic that somebody with two such disabilities would be at the forefront of promoting eugenics. And you can, I don't have time to go into the other people, but it's just remarkable. Alexis Carrel, the third person on the list, he actually laid the groundwork for organ transplantation. He developed microsurgical techniques to anastomose, to bring together arteries and sew them together in a way the blood wouldn't clot. He won the 1911 Nobel Prize for physiology or medicine. But,
Dr. Gunderman, I think we lost your audio.
that out.
There you go. Oh, it's gone again. It's gone again.
Yep, we don't have you. We lost you right after 1911 Nobel.
How about that?
Perfect.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
It happens.
I work every day in probably the most technologically intensive field in all of medicine, and yet little things like that continue to crop up from time to time. Anyway, these ideas were prevalent throughout society. You can see on the left a list of rich and famous and powerful people. I'm not trying to suggest these ideas were confined to the rich, famous, and powerful. They were everywhere. But it's sobering to realize what a wide variety of famous people found eugenics irresistible. So this, mercifully, here's the last slide. And this is a a public education poster produced by the Eugenics Society, in this case in England. But look at that. Only healthy seed must be sown. Check the seeds of hereditary disease and unfitness by eugenics. The American public, the British public, was being encouraged to get on board with eugenics and begin to make the eugenic dream a reality. And as I've indicated with my brief reference to trisomy 21, I don't think eugenics has been eliminated. The ideas that, grew into eugenics are in some respects still with us. And in fact, as we gain a deeper and deeper understanding of the so-called human genome and how to intervene in the human genome, curing diseases, but who knows, could we ever come to think of substandard intelligence as a disease, or short stature as a disease, or an increased liability to cancer as a disease in itself? It's not implausible that eugenics, in fact, is and will in the future once again rear its ugly head. We need ourselves, we need our neighbors, our fellow citizens to be knowledgeable about the history of eugenics so we can avoid Santayana's prophecy that by not knowing what happened with eugenics, we repeat the same mistakes.